Hello and welcome to Interconnected, the podcast that explores the intricate links between life's most profound, weird and wonderful things. I'm Robin Taylor.
And I'm Jake Robinson.
And in each episode we try and discuss an interesting science topic and we challenge ourselves to see if we can find some weird other subject or quirky that we can link to that main subject.
Yeah, think deep sea mining and electric guitars, or the theory of relativity and peregrine falcons.
So we hope we find this podcast thought-provoking and entertaining, and we invite you to explore the interconnectedness of life.
So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Okay, well let's hold the show a little bit and just get into what's happening in our neck of the woods before we get onto the show.
Okay, so in my neck of the woods, what's going on? So I've got 30 seconds to talk about this. First thing that comes up when I search news in Australia is Leonardo DiCaprio calls out Aussie state. So he's weighed in on a controversial issue in Australia. One state in particular was in the firing line. So the environmentalist actor has taken aim at Queensland following news that a glowing emission reduction report was based on erroneous data and was not reliable. An independent study has found that the National Carbon Accounting System for Australia may be significantly underreporting deforestation in Queensland. So that's not very good, is it?
No,
How
I have
about
heard
you
about...
in your neck of the woods, Robin?
Well, in my neck of the woods, probably the main thing that's coming up is I'm just noticing in the headlines that there's a lot more tit-for-tat politics going on here. So the current government is trying to take the previous members of the previous government to task. And it kind of echoes what seems to be happening globally as well. So people are in court for various apparent misdemeanors. Okay, so Jake, fill us in. What's the main topic for today?
Okay, so today's main topic is, drumroll, cannabis. And what is cannabis in a nutshell, Robin?
So cannabis is often referred to as marijuana. It's known as a psychoactive and for its psychoactive properties and its medicinal properties. It contains various compounds, notably something called THC and CBD. They interact with the endocannabinoid system to produce effects such as relaxation, altered perception, and pain relief. It's got a long history both for recreational and medicinal uses, and even sort of a spiritual component as well for some people. It can be consumed in various forms, such as putting it into brownies, smoking it, which is the one that most people know about, and even vaping, and even using it as a medication that you put onto various skin ailments. And it's basically got a checkered history. So I know that, Jake, you wanted to talk about cannabis in relation to it's the stigma that's associated with it, and also maybe the therapeutic and medicinal properties that it has.
Okay, so despite its long history of medicinal and therapeutic uses, there's also been a more recent sort of stigmatization of cannabis. And some of the reasons include the psychological effects of cannabis. It's often associated with short and long-term psychological effects, such as how it alters cognitive function and memory. And some people think it increases the risk of mental health disorders like psychosis and schizophrenia. But it's important to recognize that most of these studies are correlative, not causative. And that's one thing we should probably talk about, the difference between correlation versus causation. There's also some concern around its how addictive it is. So I know you've spoken before about that it's been shown to not be physiologically addictive, but it can be psychologically addictive. So there's concern that cannabis use can lead to dependence and addiction, particularly with frequent and heavy use. So withdrawal symptoms are thought to include irritability, insomnia, and anxiety when people stop using it, essentially, after they've used it for a long time. So some say smoking cannabis can have similar respiratory health risks as smoking tobacco, including coughing, phlegm production, and increased risk of respiratory infections and chronic bronchitis. So these are some of the perceived risks of cannabis. Okay, so cannabis, despite its kind of recent stigma, it has a long history of medicinal use, with ancient cultures using it to treat ailments such as pain, inflammation, and digestive issues. And today, medical cannabis is being researched and used to alleviate symptoms of conditions such as epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and even cancer. So, despite its perceived dangers, it also has many perceived benefits for health. So, it has ancient origins as well. So, cannabis has been used by humans for thousands of years, with evidence of its cultivation dating back to at least 12,000 years ago. And just think 12,000 years ago, I think the population of the entire world was something like 4 million people. So that's probably, Melbourne's probably 5 million now. So one city. So 12,000 years ago, the entire population of the world was only less than the size of Melbourne
Wow.
in terms of population. But this is when cannabis has kind of been shown to be first cultivated. And it was transported across the world by nomadic peoples.
Yes, I think one of the things that I've picked up also about marijuana in terms of the stigma is that, particularly from the 80s, it
Yeah.
was often the big argument was is that it was a gateway drug.
Okay.
So there
Yes.
was an acceptance that it was sort of not as terrible as things like heroin and smack, I think was the big thing in the 80s and stuff like that. But marijuana was in fact the gateway drug for that, in that if you had children that would be smoking that or adults, then it was just a very short step to eventually end up,
Yeah. Okay.
I think there's a uh, line from the Prince song, "Sign of the Times," where it's something like, his nephew is doing a reefer in 1 month and he's doing horse the next month, whatever
Right.
horse is. Uh,
Seem a harder
but I
drug.
presume it's
Yeah.
must be a hard drug. And
So
anyway,
what's the
so
evidence for this, for it being a gateway drug?
none.
There's no evidence. Okay.
There's
Yeah.
actually no studies that support that theory. It just seemed like an intuitive leap. You
Yeah.
do that. There is, of course, some evidence in that, let's say, you can have a progression of people that go from doing, let's say, marijuana, and then if you're in a situation where you have a society that makes it an illegal or outlawed, it means that by definition, your
Yeah.
suppliers are in fact criminals. So
Mm.
legally, they're actually criminals, and criminals aren't really renowned for differentiating where their boundaries are. I'm sure everyone has their own boundaries, but they're just as likely to be trading in marijuana as they are in coke or heroin or whatever, meth. So
Yeah.
if someone says, "Well, I want to try something a little bit more than that," then of course that you go back to the same supplier, or they would know someone who could supply it as well. So that just seems like a very intuitive leap, but no one's done any controlled studies,
Hmm.
which again seems really weird. But there's been some great studies which have looked at comparisons or comparative stuff. And so
Yeah.
if you look at, let's say, places like Portugal or Holland, where they have very, I would say, enlightened laws about marijuana usage and all that sort of stuff, then you find that the teens, or when people start to use it, they're the incidence of the population, self-reported population that actually go to use the harder drugs, is less than America for
Yeah.
the
Okay.
same. So when you match it all up, so in fact, what you're seeing is the evidence seems to show that it doesn't do that at all.
Yeah, I was going to say there's probably some details that we should consider as well in terms of the composition or the strain of the cannabis. These can probably have different effects. I know there are supposedly, is it two or three species? So cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, or they the variations of one species. Anyway, there are two main types that people smoke and consume, and they
Right.
both have different properties. So they both have different effects on the brain, for instance. So one, I think, can cause you to relax more, lead you to relax, and one can actually increase your focus. So they have different effects.
Well, I think what you're picking up on there, Jake, is this idea of, um, again, uh, an explanation where someone is trying to look for a very direct link, where they just kind of go,
Yes,
well, it's got this chemical, and that's what affects your
sure.
neuroanatomy in a certain way, and that's what then causes it. Whereas, in
Yeah,
fact, the reality is it's probably a combination of those things, but with this huge societal impact or
yes,
societal framing about what it is. So there used to be in the 60s a time where it was possible to experiment with certain drugs. And there was some studies that I remember reading about in the 90s where they'd done some experiments in the 60s where they'd done this sort of split design where they've given people sort of hash browns, which is basically cookies, which has got marijuana, baked into that. And then they split that into four quadrants. So some of the people there were told that they were eating a cookie with marijuana in it, and
Yeah.
the other half were told they weren't eating marijuana in it. And within those, they were actually split into half, and unknown to them, half of them were told the truth, and half of them were told the opposite of what was happening. And and it may not surprise you, given the way I'm talking, to know that effectively people reacted with symptoms or self-reported feelings for whatever they were told,
Yeah,
not
exactly.
what actually was in the
That's
hash
interesting. Yeah.
brown.
I
So
wonder
that's why
if
I'm
so. On a similar note, I wonder if the kind of the stigma of taking certain things actually increases the risk that you will have certain mental health conditions that are associated with that stigma in the first place. So, for instance,
yes,
social stigma and discrimination, people can actually who experience this can actually make their mental health issues worse. So, I wonder if the stigma of actually taking cannabis can lead to some of these or exacerbate some of these conditions that are associated with it, but not causatively linked with it.
right. Yeah, that's a sophisticated sort of feedback loop you're giving us, aren't you?
Yeah,
And
maybe
I guess that
maybe too
that
complex to unpick here.
no, but I think you're right in that. Again, that would suggest that depending on which society you're in,
Yes.
then that would suggest, in some societies the stigma would be worse, and in other
Yeah.
societies,
Exactly. Yeah.
that's why I think those studies which do this comparison
Between countries. Yeah.
between countries is so important, because those countries
Agreed.
do have a little bit of a different, you know,
Yeah.
societal and environmental stigma attached to those things that are there. But I
Yes.
think that one of the things that did fascinate me was I read also in the same stuff when I was learning about this, that there was a highly hallucinogenic drug that was outlawed in Persia in the 16th century, and there were whole, you know, tomes written about the psychoactive effect of this drug, and the
Hmm.
drug was caffeine.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so, I mean, sure, if we take too much caffeine, we tend to get the shakes. And those withdrawal symptoms that you spoke about, I find that interesting because I have all those symptoms if I stop, because I'm a coffee drinker.
Yes.
If I stop for a while, I definitely get headaches, and I definitely find that my digestive system changes and stuff like that. So,
Yes.
but we don't have that problem.
Speaking of caffeine, there's a really good book by Michael Pollan. He's an American journalist. It's called "This Is Your Mind on Plants," and he basically covers opium, caffeine, and maybe nicotine or might be mescaline. Anyway, it's interesting. It's got a really cool history of a really cool overview of the history of caffeine and its kind of psychoactive effects. So I recommend reading that. There's another
Oh,
good book by
okay.
him actually called How to Change Your Mind, and it's about the new science of psychedelics and yeah, the stigma associated with psychedelics is very relevant to our conversation today.
Oh,
So how they were banned and yeah, all the issues that come from
yeah,
that. But then the recent
sure.
revival in psychedelics and how it could actually open our minds to the world and feel more connected to nature, this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I know now that there's some treatments that are trying to look at LSD as a
Yes,
way of
exactly.
trying to help people with schizophrenia type symptoms. But maybe
Yes.
you could share those the links to those books.
Yes, I would.
All right. Yeah, I think that coming back to the medicinal uses and stuff like that, and you were talking
Yeah.
about correlation versus causation.
Mm.
I think that that's an interesting thing to talk about, isn't it? The way that
Yes.
the history of the way marijuana has been portrayed. So I think it's kind of interesting that at the time in the 1930s, they tried to stigmatize it, and the messaging was it turns you into this uh, mad person. And I think there was a pretty famous film called Reefer Madness that was produced in 1939, I think, 38, 39, late 30s, that tried to, talk about the basically you're going to turn into a crazed killer and you're going to lose your mind.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then the thing that after after World War II and then suddenly having the Cold War, and the Soviets were our arch enemies supposedly, and
Hmm.
then the actual effects of cannabis seems to be more of a relaxant. So
Yes.
if it is a relaxant, then that would suggest that uh, the neurochemistry is it takes up the neurotransmitters a lot easier. So I could be
Yeah.
talking out of turn here, so I'm not. Don't quote me
No, I
on
think
that.
so. I think again there are two different main kinds of cannabis, and one is more linked to relaxing, and one's more linked to focus. And there are two systems within the body, two subsystems. And you mentioned earlier the endocannabinoid system. There's two kinds of subparts of this system called the CB1 and the CB2, and they both have different receptors and chemicals that bind to the receptors. So I think the THC in the cannabis in different strains actually affects these systems in different ways.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I think that they, but what did happen is that from a societal point of view, so this is in America, we're talking about. Sorry, the idea that it was taking you into a crazed person
Yes.
changed dramatically in the 50s and 60s to it
Mm.
was going to make you a docile person and therefore not able to resist the invasion from the Soviets.
That's an
So
interesting
the
perspective.
idea was that the Soviets were going to be trying to set up these farms and try and turn all the GI Joes into docile pacifists. So it's a
Is that why
complete flip flop.
amphetamine and cocaine became more prevalent then? It was so
Yeah,
that you
who
were ready to
knows?
fight the Soviets.
Who knows? I think what's interesting about reading this, I mean, I'm not sure how, of course, unless you're a historian, but it's just this apparent acceptance by the Congress of the Times
Yeah,
to take that on to say, oh, you're crazy people if you take this stuff. And
yeah,
then, you know, 20, 30 years later saying, oh, you just turn into kind of zombies,
yes, yes.
sort of
It's
peacenik.
fascinating, isn't it, the history? It works in different ways, though. So, for instance, people like Freud, I'm sure they were taking cocaine and LSD. So it was obviously accepted in society at one point, but now it's completely not accepted in society, and
Yeah, I
you're
mean,
considered a druggie or a low life, etc. If you
yeah.
take these kind of things now.
I mean,
Very
Doors of
interesting.
Perception by Aldous Huxley, that's mescaline.
Yes, Huxley. Yeah,
So, yeah, a
exactly.
classic, a justified
Yeah,
classic, even.
yeah. So
Um,
maybe we should talk a bit more about causation versus correlation, like you say. So I've just let's have a look. You must have come across those funny, spurious correlation plots. Let's have a look. Okay, so there's one: sour cream consumption and motorcycle deaths. That's a strong correlation. Death by tangled bed sheets and cheese consumption. Honey produced by bees and drowning. Money spent on pets and death by stairs. So these are all kind of point 0.9 strong correlations, but obviously completely unrelated. So many of the studies that link cannabis use to psychosis are also correlation based. So there probably is a bit more evidence than what I've just spoken about there with these examples, but we do have to be cautious that it's not a causative link.
right.
There was one study that I mentioned earlier that showed that. So this looked at the percentage of people reporting psychotic symptoms and the risk factor category.
Mm,
And so no trauma, so this refers to childhood trauma. And so no trauma or cannabis use, the risk is something like 5% of people reporting psychotic symptoms.
yeah.
Cannabis use alone, so this means people that take cannabis that have no um, experience of trauma as a child, that's around 9 to 10%, so slightly higher.
Mm,
Trauma alone, so this is people that have experienced trauma as a child but don't smoke cannabis, that's actually higher, so that's more like 13%. Interesting. And then trauma and cannabis use combined is right up at 50%, so significant increase in risk, but again, it's correlation. It's an association study rather than a causative link,
yeah.
but an
So,
interesting dynamics across the different categories.
yeah. Do you want to, Jake, just take us through a little bit more about that? The difference in correlation. I think it's really interesting to talk about it here because our podcast is about interconnectedness, where we're actually trying to find those links. And then here we
Sure.
are trying to say, but there's no link. And of course there is a link, but it's
Sure.
a fundamental underlying cause.
Okay, so we should probably define what correlation versus causation is. So correlation refers to it's a kind of a statistical measure that describes the degree to which two variables change together. In other words, it measures the strength and directionality of the relationship between two variables. So correlation can be positive and it can be negative. However, correlations do not imply causation. So even if two variables are strongly correlated, it doesn't necessarily mean that changes in one variable cause changes in the other variable. Causation, on the other hand, refers to a relationship between two variables in which one variable, i.e., the cause, directly influences or produces a change in the other variable. And this other variable would be known as the effect. So that's how you kind of have the cause and the effect. So,
Sour
for instance,
cream.
we reeled off of some funny, spurious correlations earlier. So, death by tangled bed sheets and cheese consumption. So, the question might be, why the heck has death by tangled bed sheets increased by over 200% between 2009 and 2020? And we see this graph, this line graph. So it's sort of like a 0.9 correlation or something. And we might assume, based on this correlation, that cheese consumption leads to death by tangled bed sheets. However, this is obviously nonsense. Or is it? Until you've proven it, you can only say it's associated. So there's that kind of correlation. There's another kind of correlation we can talk about, which we're often referring to on this podcast. So we start with one variable and then we link it to another variable. But in between those two variables, there are several mediating variables. And so the original variable could cause a change in a second variable, which could cause a change in another variable, etc. And so the first variable does cause an effect in the response variable. However, it has to go through several mediating variables to get there. So there's this kind of indirect cause and effect correlation going on there. Okay, so you provided an example earlier that was quite interesting, where something might seem correlated, but there's an underlying cause to make them two variables seem correlated. And what was your example? It was to do with foot size and spelling
Right.
ability.
So when I tried to teach this concept between causation and correlation, and I've usually tried to explain to say, well, we can see a correlation between children's feet size and their spelling ability. So the argument that one causes the other. So as you said, you can have a positive correlation. So as the foot size increases, so the number of words that you can spell also increases.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing would be, if you had a causation thing that's going on here, like a causative thing, then one would cause the other. So there's two variations there. One is, as your foot grows bigger, it causes your spelling ability in your brain to somehow get better. And the other one is, as you learn more and more words to spell, it causes your feet to grow.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can kind of go either way. And maybe the thing that people don't realize is that they are correlated, but
they are correlated, but it's not the foot size, the feet size that's actually leading to the spelling ability improvement.
Or the spelling ability leading to the foot size.
Exactly.
We're saying that there's been a lot of evidence that's been produced or presented, particularly to lawmakers and policymakers, that the use of cannabis actually leads to people either becoming sick in the head or becoming they tend to do more crimes, or they tend to get more schizophrenia, or they become more paranoid, or ailments just get worse. And that again is this misconception. So the right way to do it, just because there is a correlation doesn't mean to say there is no causation, but it also doesn't say whether there is a cause as well. So you mentioned that, Jake, before, that it is possible to still have two variables that are correlated. So every time you have a causative function, there's always going to be a correlation. But the correlation itself doesn't tell us whether their cause exists or not.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that's so here we're getting into a problem where, unfortunately, to find out whether you do have a cause or not, you'd have to be in this ridiculous situation where you'd have to take normal children from the example that you spoke about before. You'd have to not care too much whether they had childhood trauma or not. And you'd have to take the ones that had trauma and the ones that didn't have trauma and force feed them or give them marijuana, and then find out what their long-term effects were as
Yes.
you carried on. And of course, that just ethically is not going to happen. And that's why we
That's
can't
why
actually make
there's a lack of causative link studies.
right, right. And in fact, it's just as likely that in this case, in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that, in fact, what people are actually doing with some of this is to self-medicate. So in other words,
Yes.
because you actually have an issue, you
Yep.
actually find relief from taking
Yes.
cannabis on board.
Yeah, true. And we spoke earlier about that it can be more complex than this. So you may have experienced childhood adversity, and so therefore you turn to things like cannabis as a coping strategy. But then the cannabis itself could potentially exacerbate the mental health issues associated with childhood adversity. So it could be this weird feedback system going on where you actually, the childhood adversity leads you to taking cannabis, but then the cannabis actually creates more mental health issues. That's only a possibility, as we've spoken about. There aren't concrete studies that show this, but
That's
there
right.
could be
That's right. I
these
think I
interesting
think
feedbacks going on.
yeah. So I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about when we do science like this.
Yeah.
Although we're not. It's not interesting that people have issues or that children have got psychoses or anything like that. But rather that I think that certainly the way that I was brought up with science is you tried your very best to cut out all your potential interactions, so you've only got one potential cause and you're measuring one potential effect. So those are the variables that we're speaking about, and that in reality that doesn't map onto real life and that complex interconnected feedback loop that you're talking about. Okay, so Jake, there's one other thing which I think is really interesting. We're talking about societal expectations about the illegal drug and marijuana is so bad and things like that.
Yes.
But I think that when you actually look at the actual research, the actual physiological research of what marijuana does to your body, I'm just going to give you a little caveat here, though, that if you do smoke it, and you did mention that, it is carcinogenic. But you would have to be smoking something like 60 major spliffs a day in order to get that carcinogenic effect. So they've done these studies on mice, and that's how they've got to just an extraordinary amount, which even the heaviest doped out person would never have that much marijuana to have those severe carcinogenic effects. So we've never demonstrated marijuana being smoked and cancer in humans, but we have in mice studies. However, I think what's really interesting is the fact that I did mention this idea before about how when you compare marijuana to another psychotropic drug that had these big hallucinogenic effects, which is caffeine, in fact, the physiological effects of marijuana and caffeine on a scale of, I don't know what the scale would be, is around about the same. And there's two recreational drugs that are much, much worse than that, and they're completely legal: nicotine and alcohol. If nicotine and alcohol were actually presented to the American FDA now, they would never pass because the physiological effects are so bad.
Yes.
The only problem is that they were established industries before the FDA was set up. I mean, to some extent, you could argue that America, as in North America, was set up on these industries. So tobacco and then alcohol later on. So
well,
alcohol, it's one of those things.
So alcohol can lead to liver disease, cardiovascular issues, weakened immune system, a high risk of certain cancers, also associated with depression, anxiety, suicide ideation.
Yeah,
all sorts of things.
Its physiological effects are much worse than marijuana.
Yes.
And yet
it's
we
addictive.
can just buy it.
Highly physiologically addictive.
Yeah, and it's physiologically addictive, yes.
Did you want to talk any more about that? Or?
No.
No.
We've got to go down another rabbit hole.
That felt really abrupt.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, basically, there's not much more to say than that, other than
true.
I
mean, excessive alcohol consumption is associated with various societal issues, including all the physiological things we've spoken about. but also car accidents, violence,
Yes.
crime. These things
Yeah.
we should probably think about.
No,
These
no,
are all
exactly.
associated with alcohol.
That's what I'm
Cannabis, the
saying. Is
societal impacts is less clear cut, but there's a famous Bill Hicks sketch where he compares them both, and I'm not going to reenact it, but I'd recommend you YouTubing Bill Hicks on cannabis versus alcohol. Okay, so let's move on to the other main part of the show, and this is the interconnected part of the show. So in each episode, we cover a main science topic, which we just have, so cannabis, but we also challenge ourselves to link it with a topic that might seem random or completely unrelated. And this week, it's your turn, Robin. So what's the topic, and how is it connected to cannabis?
okay. So my topic is I want to talk about the criminalization of marijuana and starving baleen whales.
Okay, that sounds very obscure, but
Yeah.
I'm ready for you. Go.
All right. Okay, so just a quick word about baleen whales. These are the huge whales that we think of, such as humpback whales and blue whales, bow whales, right whales. They're the ones that have these big plates, so they usually have these big, huge throats that they can open out, and they tend to eat small krill or very small organisms. And what they're doing is they're actually taking in a huge gulp of water and then pushing all the water out through these filters, which are their baleen plates, which is why they're called baleen whales. And then they take their huge tongue and just lick off all the nutrients that are inside and gobble that down. And it's so rich and so nutrient dense that's why they're able to grow to these massive sizes. It always confuses me that as a boy, it's just like built into our DNA. Well, it was for mine anyway, that we've got to be addicted to dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are just the best thing ever as you grow up.
Yes.
And yet the blue whale
too.
is in fact larger than any dinosaur, the largest dinosaur that we know of. So it's kind of supposed to be the largest living animal ever that we've ever found. And that's basically because of its ability to eat this krill, these very small shrimp-like things. All right,
But that
let's go
just
back
says
to
something about the abundance of krill, doesn't it? Wow, mind-blowing.
Okay, so let's go back to the criminalization of marijuana. So I think that there is probably this would be something where I'm just going to present it as a straightforward set of facts, and I'll have to qualify it afterwards. All right. So there is some evidence to suggest that there are relationships between the first director of the Federal Narcotics Bureau, who was the charge of legalizing or criminalizing different types of drugs, and the DuPont family. And the DuPont family are basically people who are into chemistry and doing chemical products and doing that. And they had come up with a revolutionary new product, a synthetic product, which we now know as being plastics. But it started off with nylon. And their big breakthrough was to try and think about it as being nylon rope. Nylon rope was basically used a lot for hawser ropes or ropes that you'd use in shipping and rigging and stuff like that. Wasn't as good as the products that we have today, so tended to be a bit more brittle and not quite so capable as the main product that they were using then at that time, which was hemp. And cannabis is in fact part of the hemp family. So there are something like 23 varieties of hemp, if my memory serves me correctly, and 3 of those have these psychotropic effects where that THC is produced in significant quantity. All of them produce THC, but only 3 of them have enough to be able to give you a psychoactive experience. So the other ones I use tend to be more used for things like rope, but it can have many other aspects as well, such as paper production. So you didn't have to kind of pulp softwoods and all that. You can just use the hemp plant for that.
And I heard that if the hemp paper got wet, then it would dry out and it'd still be just as strong. Whereas
hemp has
if
got
normal paper got wet, it would just disintegrate.
Yes. Yeah. So it seems to have natural fungicides in it as well, and ability to resist basically getting moldy, which is why it was used in shipping rigging. So of course it's getting wet all the time, and then you can imagine with all those fibers, there'd be lovely dark places for mold to grow. that would be back into your realm, but it can resist all of that as well. So it can expand and contract at a regular rate, so not in a way which actually causes things to split or to. So it's got these incredible properties to be used, and of course it's a renewable resource, and unlike nylon,
Yeah.
doesn't require a fossil fuel. So hemp is almost like the better product. So here's the conspiracy theory or the logic or the explanation that went behind this. And I'm going to stick with this to keep my linkage going here. But in other words, that the DuPont family had connections within Congress who then appointed this first director of it, a gentleman called Harry Anslinger, who then outlawed the hemp or outlawed cannabis, and in doing so, outlawed all of hemp. So
Wow.
all the
When was this?
varieties for
Sorry,
growing
Robin.
this.
When are we
This would
talking?
have been in 1937.
Okay.
So, and then went on a big media campaign to try and, explain how bad it was. So I think they started off with basically putting some taxes in place that actually made it very hard for you to actually grow the hemp in the first place. And then eventually just became more and more criminalized. So what now happens is, well, what's the replacement now that you can't have hemp as your rope? Well, funnily enough, it's nylon. And then
Who'd
you
have
can
thought
start
it?
to use all of that. And this nylon was in fact the first commercial use of plastics that we had on a large scale.
Yeah, okay.
And this plastic industry could be considered to have its kind of origin in nylon being used in a certain way. And so we're just going to fast forward here, but when you think about things like fishing nets and refuse and stuff like that, and we've now heard a lot about microplastics that are there.
Yeah.
And so what you now get is a lot of microplastics where the plastics have gradually broken down, and then they become things which now we can see stories of animals ingesting a lot of it. And one of the ones that comes from that is basically the microplastics will tend to float at certain layers. And there has been some studies that suggest that you've got baleen whales now tend to eat their food at the depth at which the microplastics are
Wow.
accumulating. And so now what you're getting is a stomach full of microplastics, means it gums up the digestive system. And even though their bellies are full, they're not actually getting any nutrients. So they're actually starving because
Wow.
their bellies are full of plastic. And so that's my linkage. Let me just qualify that very quickly, which is that I'm not claiming it's a direct causal link. There are so many other things
Sure.
that interplay with that as
Yeah.
well,
But we
such
spoke about those
as
mediating links earlier,
right.
so that's
Yes.
that
Okay.
that kind of example.
All right.
Yeah.
I don't need to explain it. You've already
You
got
don't
me.
need to explain it. We already did it.
Yeah.
That's
So
good.
what do you
It's a
think?
great link. I reckon. Ooh, a 9.3.
Oh,
That's,
I'll take it. I'll take
it's
it.
getting better. It's getting better.
Yeah.
No, that's a great link. So, yeah, summarize again. So, in one sentence, summarize your link,
All right.
starting with cannabis.
So criminalize cannabis,
Yes.
uh, criminalize all hemp varieties,
Mm-hmm.
take out hemp rope, allows
Yep.
nylon to be used instead, which is the start of plastics as a commercial grade material that we use. Plastics become microplastics, gum up baleen whale stomachs, they starve.
Boom. Wow. So, what books do you have to recommend, Robin, on this subject? I know there's one, something to do with Emperor. What's that one?
Yeah, that
The
one is
Emperor Wears No
called.
Clothes, is it?
Yeah, the emperor wears no clothes. That's right, and that's referring to the
Yes.
idea that I think that basically hemp can also be used as a clothing material as well, and it's very
And a
pleasant,
book. And a book material.
and even in book material,
And
correct?
many other things. So some people swear by hemp, don't they? Like you could almost link it to things like climate change and, mass deforestation, because you could argue that deforestation wouldn't be needed if we grew hemp which is an incredibly sustainable crop. So we could use hemp to produce our wood, our paper, there's a thing called hempcrete now, so it's a bit like concrete, but a sustainable version. So all of these things that we now use, even fuels as well, to fuel our vehicles. I
Right.
think there was a story, wasn't there a story about Henry Ford wanting to use hemp, and then the nylon thing happened, and then hemp got outlawed, so then we started looking for more fossil
Oh, I
fuels.
don't know that one.
So I think that actually triggered that as well. So
Okay,
Man, hemp has
I
got
don't know
some
that one.
incredible links. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think Henry Ford was experimenting with hemp probably just before it was the prohibition, um, to use it in his cars as a sustainable energy. But then obviously all hemp got completely banned in America at least, and probably a lot of other places on the planet.
Yeah.
So then we started searching for alternatives, um, i.e., hydrocarbons,
Mm.
unsustainable fossil fuels that were fueling
Oh,
our cars. So,
yeah. The
so
book that
banning hemp
we're
could actually be responsible for climate change. Sorry, carry on.
yeah, I was going to say that just to follow up on what you're saying. The Emperor
Yeah,
Wears No Clothes by Jack Herer.
yeah,
Herer.
Hera, I think. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, that's a. I mean, I've got quite a number of books on this, but that's a really accessible one,
yeah,
and does give a good overview, and I think it's been updated. So
yeah, amazing. Okay, so hemp's such an amazing, it's like a super material, isn't it? So what are the ways forward now? What can we do to, we've just implicated it in climate change, in microplastics clogging up baleen whales' stomachs and all these sorts of things. So what are the ways forward now?
that's a great question, Jake. And I think that the answer is something on the lines of we do have to look at the policies about
Yes.
where things are at the moment. I suspect that we probably need to look towards the countries that have already tried to take significant steps towards that
Okay.
and try and figure out how we can learn from what they're doing. And
So
there
are
are
any
these.
countries at the moment, are they producing hemp products on a mass scale?
Well, that's an interesting question as well. I believe that there's some like I think Portugal, you are able to do that, but I think there's
Okay.
still some laws that are a little bit outdated. Like Holland has always had legal marijuana, so you can go in and have,
Yeah.
you can go into a bar which can sell you different varieties of marijuana, a bit like a coffee connoisseur. You can be a
Yeah.
marijuana connoisseur.
Hmm.
But my understanding is about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I was reading about it that they're in this weird situation where their laws don't allow you to grow it on a commercial scale.
Hmm.
So you're allowed to have it as a commercial product, but you can't grow it on a
Wow.
commercial scale, in which
Why is
case,
that?
because their laws are a little bit outdated. But what it means is that they're back into if you want to use it on a commercial level, you actually
Yeah.
have to import it from countries that are growing it illegally.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Madness.
So
And
I
import
think,
it, which is again
right, and how
contributing to
you got to
climate
import it
change.
across that's right.
Hmm.
So,
Reducing
but
its
once it's in
sustainability
Holland,
factor. Hmm.
it used to be. I don't know. Again, I don't know if I'm updated on that. But at that time, once it's in Holland, no problem.
Yeah. And
But
it's fine growing in a temperate environment, right? So you
yes.
could
Well,
you could grow
you
it on a mass scale in Holland, for instance.
well, you can't grow it outdoor. I mean, it would be too
Okay,
cold for
yeah.
that. You'd have to grow it indoor. But they're
In
great. I mean, there's a lot
polytunnels.
of
Yeah.
science behind it, especially
Sure.
for people trying to grow it in their basements with artificial light, with it
Yes.
not growing too high. So
Yeah.
you want these. Most of the people that are selling that is for the psychoactive stuff, not for the material that we
Sure.
can use it for afterwards. But I think that to answer your question, it would be something on the lines of we need to learn from these other countries and then
Yes.
start to rationalize those criminal laws with other drugs that we do know are dangerous, such as we did mention alcohol and nicotine. So there are probably other ways to look at when people say, oh, but it has these societal effects and stuff like that. Well, so does
Mm.
alcohol and nicotine. And there are, like Alcoholics Anonymous would be a very famous one from there. There are societal solutions, not legal solutions that put you into the criminal bracket. So having support
Sure.
groups and working about every substance can be abused, of course.
Mm.
I did remember a very amusing case when I was studying biology at first and got first introduced to that about someone who died from being addicted to carrot juice, and they were drinking something in excess of 16 liters of carrot juice a day, and
Wow.
then they got some sort of vitamin A poisoning as a
Oh.
consequence. Probably is an urban myth, but I mean, the point is you really can have too much of
Well, you can
everything.
have too much water, so yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, so
Hmm.
I think that's the way forward. Is we need to be educated about the science behind what actually is happening with
Yeah.
to come back to what you were saying before about this is a really good example about the science can't be isolated by itself. It has to be looked
Yes.
at with social policies and, the historical precedents and why we get to where we are today. I think
But
that's
that's
probably
one
the
of the
way
reasons
forward.
we're doing this podcast, right? Is to draw those links between all these things instead of
Yeah,
looking at science in isolation.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Anything more on that? Or should we
No, I
move
think
on?
we're good.
That's pretty cool, though. Yeah, you should look into that. I think that's correct about the Henry Ford thing, but we should probably look it up. But that's nuts, right? Imagine if the whole fossil fuel industry was fueled by banning hemp.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the
Well,
planet could be so much healthier now.
yeah, we could have. I mean, probably it's one of those things where I was thinking about that before. I mean, it would have still been used. It would have still
Yeah,
been, but maybe we had a chance. We would have had a chance for it to have been introduced slowly, so we could have seen how the
the
effects of
effects.
fossil
Yeah,
fuel could have been. And
maybe.
at least we wouldn't be using it as much. Where's that time machine when you need it? I mean, we
Exactly.
don't ask for much. We just want a time machine
It's on a time
so we
machine.
can answer these questions.
Yes.
Okay, so Jake, have you seen any recent TikTok videos from the invisible world?
Have I seen any tweets from the invisible world? Well, news from the invisible world this week is about crop rotation and native microbiome inoculations, how they restore soil capacity to suppress a root disease. Okay, so in simple terms, some soils have a natural ability to protect plants from getting sick, but we're not sure which soils are best at this and how we can make them even better at doing it. So the authors of this study, they did some experiments to find out. They looked at how different farming practices, such as growing the same crop in the same place every year, so this is known as monocropping or monoculture cropping, versus changing crops each year. So this refers to rotation, rotating the crops around. How these practices affect the microbes living in the soil around the plant roots. And the microbes can microbes around plant roots can either hurt or help plants when it comes to fighting off diseases. And what they found was that soils where crops were rotated tend to have a more helpful set of microbes that fight off the diseases compared to soils where the same crop is grown every year. So when they looked even closer, they saw that certain helpful microbes were missing in monocropped soils because they weren't getting enough food to survive. But when they added these missing microbes in, so this is what I refer to as this microbial inoculants, so they inoculated these helpful microbes back into the soil, and it made the plants better at fighting off the diseases. So their study shows that the microbes living in the soil play a big role in keeping plants healthy, and that we might be able to use these helpful microbes to make soils better at fighting diseases in the future. So that's the news from the invisible world this week. What do you reckon? Interesting, huh?
I tell you what, it reminds me a little bit of the work that you've been involved in with healthy urban microbiome initiatives, the HUMI stuff,
Yeah,
where it seems like the rotational crops are basically allowing a much more biodiverse sort of set of
yes,
microbes to live in rather than just having, just a smaller number set. And one of
yeah,
the things that I've been learning since meeting your crew, so the whole sort of microbial ecology behind it is, I just don't think when we're not in that sphere, we don't seem to understand that diversity and how it really is a complete, very different level of an ecological system that's there, that is as complex as looking at something like all the animals or the megafauna on the Serengeti
exactly.
plain, or looking at a coral reef. We just don't think of things as being, because it's invisible, so out of sight, out of mind, I guess.
Precisely, yeah. And that's
Yeah,
the reason we've got this section in the show, is to draw the connection between the visible world and the invisible world, and how everything that we see intimately depends on everything we can't see. I always say that quote, but it's true. Um,
yeah.
so why do pathogens thrive in these monoculture systems where they're not being rotated and they have a lack of diverse plant species? Well, in monoculture systems, there's a consistent food source, so the same plants, the same plant species that's available for pathogens. So this allows pathogens to specialize in infecting that particular plant species, and then
Mm,
it's able to thrive and build up in the soil over time. And yes, you mentioned biodiversity. So monocultures typically lack diversity in plant species. Okay, so in many monoculture ecosystems, the actual soil microbiome is more diverse than, say, a natural ecosystem. And this is because it contains lots of opportunistic species and lots of fleeting species that are kind of generalists. Whereas in more natural ecosystems, the alpha diversity, so the number of microbes in the soil, might be lower, but they're more niche adapted, so they're more adapted to that specific type of ecosystem, and they thrive there over longer periods of time. So the diversity of them can be actually lower because they don't have so many of these opportunistic, fleeting species passing through. But what's important to note that in natural ecosystems, the genetic diversity and the functional diversity is often much higher, and the complexity of the ecosystem as well. So the number of different types of interactions between the microbes is often more complex, and this is implicated in things like ecosystem health in general. So without this kind of complex microbial ecosystem, there might not be as many beneficial microbes present to suppress pathogens or compete with them for resources. I think we mentioned a couple of weeks ago that one of the key reasons that having a diverse microbiome is important is because they can outcompete the pathogens for food resources, essentially. But it has to be a high diversity of particular kind of microbes.
Right. I was going to say that because of the relatively high turnover of lifespans in microbes, you mentioned something that I hadn't thought about before, which is this paper is talking about inoculating the sort of diversity back again. So presumably the microbes that are in fact feeding on the monoculture, they could be losing their ability to fight against these absent microbes because it's biologically, energetically expensive to keep that up, or just random genetic drift will allow some of this ability to drift out. So inoculating it back in again suddenly means that there might be quite a big effect where it really knocks down those pathogens. Would that be right?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I mean, it's still early days in terms of experimenting with inoculants, but there is some evidence to suggest that inoculating some species can actually proliferate, and it can have long-term effects, and they can potentially outcompete those opportunistic pathogens that are present. Yeah.
Nice. My image is always of the Lord of the Rings trilogy with Helm's Deep, I think, with just, I think where there's a big attack there, and I try and explain that to my students about how we've got to think of these epic battles are occurring all the time in the microbial world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so antibiotics actually evolved because certain microbes were trying to protect themselves against the weapons of other microbes. So the antibiotics that we use in our body, they were actually evolved in microbes for the same reason, but protecting them against other microbial species. So there's a constant battles going on, but also constant kind of mutualistic relationships as well, much like in our human world where some people are fighting, some people are loving each other and helping each other out.
Sweet.
Sweet. All right. Okay, so is there anything else you want to cover on this podcast, Robin, before we wrap up for today?
Just to very briefly say, Jake, that I like the way that we're making these connections and trying to explain a little bit more about the diversity, and I'm really enjoying the way we're trying to make those connections. And this time round, where you're trying to explain a little bit more about the difference between correlation and causation and how we've got potential links, and our podcast is explicit about exploring those links, but for me it's an insight to figure out that we need to be careful about not making the links feel like one causes the other.
Sure, there are mediating variables in between. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, cool.
I don't think I've got anything else to say other than it'd be great if anybody has any feedback for us, because we'd like to improve the show. And please leave any comments below if you're watching on YouTube. And we're excited to present the next show in a couple of weeks, and we'll see you then on Interconnected. Thanks for tuning in. Bomb.